The cold marble of the Supreme Court Plaza seemed to hum with a unique, pre-dawn energy, a palpable thrum of anticipation that vibrated up through the soles of the shoes of the assembled journalists, protesters, and curious onlookers. It was a city accustomed to power plays and political theater, yet this day felt different. This was not about a bill being debated in the vaulted chambers of Congress, or a policy announcement from the steps of the White House. This was about the very architecture of the digital age, a question poised to be answered within the hallowed, silent halls of the highest court in the land. The case, officially docketed as Federal Government v. Alliance for Digital Freedom, had been colloquially dubbed the Fight for the Future, a title that, for once, did not feel like an exaggeration. At its heart was the Digital Sovereignty and Data Privacy Act, or DSDPA, a sweeping piece of legislation that sought to grant the government unprecedented authority to manage and protect the nation's collective data infrastructure, treating it as a strategic national asset, akin to its airspace or territorial waters. Proponents hailed it as a necessary shield in an era of cyber threats and digital espionage. Opponents decried it as the most significant governmental overreach in a century, a digital dragnet that threatened the fundamental tenets of privacy and free expression. Now, after months of lower court battles and feverish public debate, it had arrived here, at the final arbiter, inside a temporary office suite a few blocks away. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and focused determination. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General and the chosen counsel to argue the government's case, stood before a large whiteboard covered in a chaotic web of legal citations, historical precedents, and handwritten notes. Her posture was erect, her gaze sharp, cutting through the weary haze of the pre-dawn hours. She was not a woman given to nervous energy. Instead, a quiet intensity radiated from her, a stillness that commanded the attention of the four junior attorneys who formed her team. They were exhausted, having wargamed every conceivable question and counter-argument for weeks, but her own stamina seemed inexhaustible. Her eyes were fixed on a small, unassuming index card pinned to the very center of the board. It contained only a few typed words, a reference to a legal theory so audacious, so contrary to the expected lines of argument, that her team had initially viewed it as a high-risk intellectual exercise rather than a viable strategy. But Bondi saw it differently. She saw it not as a risk, but as the only path through the fortress of established First and Fourth Amendment jurisprudence that her opponent was sure to build. They will expect a frontal assault, she said, her voice calm and measured, breaking the long silence. She turned to face her team, her expression one of a seasoned general briefing her officers before a decisive battle. They have prepared for us to argue necessity. They have prepared for us to cite national security threats. They will have 100 counterexamples, a litany of what-ifs designed to paint the DSDPA as a tool of oppression. She picked up a dry erase marker, its click echoing in the quiet room. Julian Hayes is a brilliant civil liberties advocate. He will paint a beautiful, terrifying picture of a dystopian future. He will appeal to the hearts of the justices, to their sworn duty to protect the individual from the state. She paused, letting the weight of that reality settle. We will not fight him on that ground. We will not allow this to be a debate between security and liberty. That is a false dichotomy, and it is a battle we are likely to lose in this chamber. A young attorney, Marcus Thorne, a recent law school graduate whose eagerness was matched only by his intellect, shifted in his chair. So we concede the First Amendment implications, he asked, a note of concern in his voice. Bondi offered a slight, reassuring smile. Not at all, Marcus. We recontextualize them. We don't argue that security trumps liberty. We argue that in the digital realm, true liberty cannot exist without a foundational layer of security provided by a sovereign entity. We are not taking something away. We are protecting the very platform on which their freedoms are exercised. She tapped the index card on the board. The inherent custodial duty of the sovereign. That is our ground. It's not in the headlines. It's not in the popular debate, and I guarantee you, it is not in the primary section of Julian Hayes's binder. The theory was elegant in its simplicity and breathtaking in its scope. It posited that long before the Constitution was written, The very concept of a sovereign nation included an implicit, fundamental duty to protect its essential assets for the collective good of its people. In the 18th century, that meant protecting borders from invasion and currency from debasement. In the 21st century, Bondi would argue, it meant protecting the nation's data, the lifeblood of its economy, its infrastructure, and its public discourse from foreign manipulation and catastrophic collapse. The DSDPA, therefore, was not a new grant of power but merely the modern expression of a timeless, inherent responsibility. It was a paradigm shift, an attempt to sidestep the entire traditional debate and force the court to consider the issue from a completely new and, Bondi hoped, undeniable perspective. Miles away, in a far more luxurious office overlooking the Capitol Dome, Julian Hayes was also making his final preparations. He was the lion of the civil liberties bar, a man whose eloquence in defense of the individual was legendary. He stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, rehearsing his opening lines, his reflection a portrait of calm confidence, his team a collection of the sharpest legal minds from the Alliance for Digital Freedom, listened with admiration. Hayes was in his element. He saw the case in clear, stark terms, a government hungry for control, and a citizenry whose fundamental rights were at risk. They will talk about threats, Hayes said, turning from the window, his voice resonant and persuasive even in the confines of the office. They will invoke specters of chaos and disorder. Our task is to remind the court that the greatest threat has always been the slow, steady erosion of freedom in the name of safety. The DSDPA is not a shield. It is a cage, a gilded one, perhaps, with promises of security, but a cage nonetheless. He looked at his lead associate. Pam Bondi is sharp. She won't make it easy. She will be pragmatic, methodical. But the facts, and a century of this court's own precedent, are on our side. We must keep them focused on the individual, on the single voice that this act could silence, on the private thought that this act could expose. That is where we will win. He was ready. He had anticipated every argument, every citation he believed the government could possibly muster. He was prepared for a battle of inches, a grinded-out war of precedent and interpretation. He had no idea that Pam Bondi was not planning to engage him on his chosen field of battle at all. As the clock ticked toward 10, the city's nervous energy converged on 1st Street Northeast. The media presence was immense. Satellite trucks hummed, their dishes aimed at the sky as if to broadcast the coming judgment to the heavens. Evelyn Reed, the veteran legal analyst for a major news network, stood before a camera, her expression serious and composed. "What we are about to witness," she said, her voice a familiar beacon of calm analysis in a sea of speculation, "is more than just a legal argument. It is a philosophical collision. On one side, you have Julian Hayes arguing from a deep tradition of American individualism and skepticism of state power. On the other, Pam Bondi, arguing for a vision of collective security in an age where our biggest vulnerabilities are no longer physical but digital. The central question for the 9 justices today is this: does the Constitution's 18th century framework have the flexibility to accommodate 21st century threats without breaking its fundamental promises? The answer they formulate will echo for generations. Inside, the transition from the chaotic energy of the plaza to the solemn grandeur of the Supreme Court chamber was abrupt and profound. The air was cool and still, heavy with the weight of history. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the space, the soaring ceiling, the marble columns, the heavy crimson drapery. It was all designed to inspire awe, to remind every person who entered that they were in a place where mere politics was supposed to yield to the enduring principles of law. Pam Bondi and her team took their seats at one of the polished wooden tables. She placed her leather-bound notes before her, but she did not open them. Her gaze was directed toward the 9 empty chairs on the raised dais. She took a slow, deep breath, centering herself, her mind a placid lake of preparation. Across the narrow aisle, Julian Hayes gave her a brief, professional nod, which she returned in kind. They were adversaries, but they were also members of a small, elite fraternity of advocates who had earned the right to stand in this room. The respect was mutual, the stakes absolute. A sharp rap of a gavel broke the hushed silence. The Honorable, the Chief Justice, and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. The Marshal of the Court announced, her voice ringing with authority. All in the room rose, as the 9 black-robed figures emerged from behind the crimson curtains and took their seats. In the center sat Chief Justice John Roberts, his expression studious and impassive. To his left and right, the other 8 justices settled in, a diverse tableau of judicial philosophies and temperaments. There was Justice Alistair Finch, a staunch textualist whose questions often resembled a rigorous grammatical inquiry. There was Justice Elena Santiago, a pragmatic jurist known for her focus on the real-world consequences of the court's decisions. And there was Justice Samuel Thornton, often silent, but whose rare questions were known to be devastatingly precise. The Chief Justice leaned into his microphone. We will hear argument first this morning in Case 23-145, Federal Government versus the Alliance for Digital Freedom. He nodded toward the table on the right. Mr. Hayes. Julian Hayes rose and walked to the lectern with the easy confidence of a man in his natural habitat. Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, he began, his voice filling the chamber, rich and resonant. The framers of our Constitution understood a simple, profound truth, that power, once granted to a government, is seldom relinquished. They built a system of checks and balances, of enumerated powers and inviolable rights, to guard against the concentration of authority. The Digital Sovereignty and Data Privacy Act, the DSDPA, represents the most direct challenge to that system. In the modern era, for the next 30 minutes, Hayes delivered a masterclass in oral advocacy. He wove together threads from the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments, arguing that the Act's provisions for data monitoring, content moderation, and infrastructure control constituted an unconstitutional trifecta of prior restraint, unreasonable search and seizure of private property without due process. The justices engaged him vigorously. Justice Santiago pressed him on the practical realities. Mr. Hayes, the government presents evidence of sophisticated state-sponsored cyber operations designed to destabilize our financial markets and public discourse. Is it your position that the Constitution requires us to remain vulnerable to such attacks, that there is no proactive role for the government to play in securing this critical infrastructure? Justice Santiago, Hayes replied smoothly, the Constitution does not demand vulnerability. It demands precision. The government already possesses tools, warrants, subpoenas, targeted investigations to address specific threats. The DSDPA is not a scalpel. It is a sledgehammer. It treats every citizen as a potential threat, every piece of data as a potential weapon. It substitutes the warrant, based on probable cause, with a system of pervasive, preemptive surveillance. That is a trade our Constitution does not permit. Justice Finch leaned forward, peering over his spectacles. But counselor, where in the text of the Constitution does it speak to data, or the Internet? Are we not in a realm where the original public meaning of the text offers little guidance, forcing us to rely on the principles behind the words? With respect, Justice Finch, Hayes countered, the text speaks of persons, houses, papers, and effects. It is a bedrock principle of this court's jurisprudence that these protections are not confined to their 18th century physical manifestations. The papers and effects of a modern citizen are their emails, their search histories, their digital lives. The principle is the same, the right to be secure against unreasonable searches. That principle is timeless and applies with even greater force to the digital domain, where the entirety of a person's life can be stored and scrutinized. Hayes was performing brilliantly. He was parrying, deflecting, and reinforcing his core message with every answer. The momentum was clearly with him. The narrative he was weaving was powerful and familiar. The story of David versus Goliath, the individual against the Leviathan state. A low murmur of approval could be felt among the observers in the public gallery. Pam Bondi sat perfectly still, listening, her face an unreadable mask of concentration. She was letting him build his fortress, brick by brick. She knew that a direct assault would fail. Her only chance was to reveal a hidden door he didn't even know existed. Finally, the Chief Justice nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. He then looked to the other table. Ms. Bondi. Pam Bondi rose and approached the lectern. The rustle of her suit was the only sound in the suddenly silent chamber. She adjusted the microphone slightly, her movements economical and precise. She looked at the Chief Justice, then let her gaze sweep across the entire bench. "Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," she began, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the oratorical flourish that had marked Hayes's presentation. "My distinguished colleague, Mr. Hayes, has passionately and eloquently defended a vision of individual liberty that is central to our national identity. We do not dispute the importance of that vision." This opening caught some by surprise. It was a concession, a sign of respect, and it immediately lowered the adversarial temperature in the room. However, she continued, "The framework he presents is incomplete. It views the digital world as a collection of individual islands, each to be defended separately. We contend that the digital world is not a series of islands, but a shared continent, a new world upon which our entire modern society is built. And like any discovered world, its very habitability depends on a foundational level of order and security." Justice Santiago was the first to interject. "Ms. Bondi, are you suggesting a lesser standard of protection for rights in the digital space?" "Not at all, Justice Santiago," Bondi replied without hesitation. "I am suggesting that we cannot protect those rights effectively without first acknowledging the nature of the space itself. The DSDPA is not primarily about surveillance of individuals. It is about the architectural integrity of the continent. It is about ensuring the roads are safe, the bridges are sound, and the foundations are not being systematically undermined by hostile actors. The liberty Mr. Hayes champions the freedom to speak, to transact, to associate online is meaningless if the platform on which it exists is compromised, chaotic, or controlled by forces antithetical to those very freedoms." She was laying the groundwork carefully, methodically. She answered several more questions about the scope and mechanics of the act, demonstrating a deep command of its technical details. She was building credibility, showing the court she was not an ideologue but a pragmatist. She could see Julian Hayes at his table, listening intently, a slight frown on his face. He was trying to anticipate her endgame, but she had not yet revealed her true line of attack. Then, she decided it was time. She took a small, almost imperceptible breath. "The core of our argument," she said, her tone shifting from pragmatic explanation to foundational principle, "rests not on a modern interpretation of enumerated powers, but on a duty that is inherent to the concept of sovereignty itself, a duty that predates the Constitution and informs its very purpose. The inherent custodial duty of the sovereign to protect the vital assets of the nation for the common good." A stillness fell over the courtroom. This was new. This was the territory she had mapped out in the pre-dawn hours. Justice Finch was the first to challenge it, as she knew he would be. "A custodial duty, Ms. Bondi, that is a rather novel term in our constitutional lexicon. Where does this duty originate? It is not in the text. With all due respect, Justice Finch," Bondi answered, her voice unwavering. "The duty is not in the text in the same way the word sovereignty is not in the text, yet it is the bedrock principle upon which the entire document is built. This court has long recognized inherent sovereign powers, the power to manage foreign affairs, to acquire territory, to protect our borders. These are not explicitly enumerated, but are understood to be essential attributes of a nation. We argue that in the 21st century, the duty to protect the integrity of the nation's foundational data infrastructure is of the same character. It is the digital equivalent of border security. One cannot be a sovereign nation if one cannot control one's own territory, be it physical or digital." She was drawing them in, forcing them to think beyond the familiar confines of the First and Fourth Amendments. She could feel the intellectual curiosity of the justices, even the skeptical ones. But she knew the decisive moment would come from the man in the center chair, Chief Justice John Roberts, the institutionalist, the man most concerned with the court's legitimacy and the careful, incremental development of the law. He had been listening intently, his face a study in concentration, his pen making occasional notes on his pad. Now, he leaned forward, his expression one of deep, intellectual skepticism. He saw the danger in her argument, the potential for a vast, undefined new realm of government power. "Ms. Bondi," the Chief Justice began, his voice measured and firm, the voice of a man about to expose a fatal flaw in a legal argument. "While your theory is intellectually intriguing, the danger of recognizing such unenumerated duties is that they often lack a limiting principle. If the government has a broad custodial duty over the nation's data, what is to stop that duty from swallowing the rights of every individual? Who uses that data? Where is the line? Your argument seems to create a positive power out of whole cloth, a power not enumerated in the Constitution. And that is a path this court has always been rightly hesitant to tread. Where," he repeated, his gaze sharpening, "is the limiting principle?" This was it, the question she had anticipated, the question upon which her entire strategy hinged. The air in the courtroom became electric. Every reporter leaned forward, pens poised. Julian Hayes watched, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, believing the Chief Justice had just cornered her. Pam Bondi did not look down at her notes. She did not hesitate. She met the Chief Justice's intense gaze with a look of calm, unwavering respect. Her focus narrowed until it felt as if she and he were the only two people in the room. "With respect, Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice dropping slightly in volume but gaining immensely in intensity. "The limiting principle is not one we have to invent. It is the very one you so eloquently and carefully articulated in your majority opinion in National Federation of Independent Business v. Sebelius." The name of the landmark case, his own landmark case, landed in the silent courtroom with the force of a physical object. A ripple of shock went through the gallery. It was an audacious move, to use the Chief Justice's own most famous and controversial ruling as the foundation for her argument. His pen, which had been moving toward his notepad, stopped dead in its tracks, hovering an inch above the paper. Bondi pressed on, her timing perfect. "The principle is not a grant of a new, boundless power, but a recognition of a pre-existing sovereign responsibility. Just as you reasoned that the government's power to tax is a fundamental condition of its existence, a power to be regulated but not denied, so too is its duty to protect the foundational integrity of the nation's information commons. The DSDPA is not creating a power, Mr. Chief Justice. It is merely the regulation of an inherent, pre-existing duty. To deny the existence of the duty itself," she concluded, her voice now a model of quiet, irrefutable logic, "would be to deny the very nature of sovereignty, a concept this court, and you yourself, have upheld for more than 2 centuries. The silence that followed was unlike any other. It was not a pause for thought. It was a vacuum. It was the sound of a supercomputer of a mind, the mind of the Chief Justice of the United States, screeching to a halt. His response, which had been forming on his lips, simply vanished. His mouth, which had been poised to deliver a follow-up, a rebuttal, remained slightly parted. The words were gone. He was frozen. In that moment, the entire dynamic of the room, of the case, of the public debate was irrevocably altered. Pam Bondi had not just answered his question, she had taken his own intellectual architecture, the product of his own deepest judicial reasoning on the limits of federal power, and used it as the cornerstone for her argument. She had shown him that to reject her premise, the existence of an inherent sovereign duty, he might have to undermine the very logic he had used to save the Affordable Care Act years before. He was not trapped by a clever quip, but by the profound consistency of his own jurisprudence. The pause stretched. 1 second, 2, 3. It felt like an eternity. The cinematic quality of the moment was undeniable. The Chief Justice, a figure of immense power and intellect, was visibly, undeniably, stopped in his tracks. His eyes, usually so focused and penetrating, seemed to look past Bondi, into the middle distance, as if he were rapidly recalculating the entire legal and philosophical equation. He was searching, not for a clever retort, but for a path, any path, that would allow him to reconcile his skepticism of her argument with the inescapable logic of his own past reasoning. His hand, still holding the pen, remained frozen in mid-air. Pam Bondi did not break her gaze. She did not smile. She did not show a hint of triumph. Her expression was one of absolute focus and respect, as if she were simply holding a space open for him to process the undeniable legal truth she had just laid at his feet. Her stillness amplified the tension, her focused gaze a silent testament to the precision of her masterstroke. It was a look that said, "I have the utmost respect for you in this court, and that is why I have presented you with an argument worthy of your deepest consideration." The other justices were riveted. Justice Santiago had a look of pure, unadulterated intellectual appreciation on her face, a slight nod acknowledging the sheer craft of the argument. Justice Finch seemed to be mentally rereading the text of Sibelius, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Across the aisle, the look of anticipated victory had evaporated from Julian Hayes's face, replaced by one of dawning, horrified realization. He had prepared for a fight on a familiar battlefield, and Pam Bondi had just revealed that the battle was actually taking place on a completely different continent, one where she had secretly mapped every inch of the terrain. He saw his carefully constructed fortress of individual rights, so strong moments before, now looking isolated and vulnerable, disconnected from this new, foundational question of sovereignty. The silence became the story. The court sketch artists, their hands flying across their pads, focused on the two central figures, Bondi, poised and powerful in her stillness, Roberts, rested in a moment of profound, unwilling hesitation. The reporters in the press section were scribbling frantically, not just recording the words, but trying to capture the sheer, unscripted drama of the pause. They knew, instinctively, that this was the moment, this was the exchange that would lead every news report. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, but was likely no more than 7 or 8 seconds, the Chief Justice stirred. The spell was broken, but the effect lingered. He drew a slow breath. The pen in his hand finally lowered to the pad, but it did not write. He blinked, his focus returning to Bondi at the lectern. But the sharp, prosecutorial edge was gone from his voice. When he spoke, it was softer, more subdued, almost inquisitive. The question itself was a concession, an admission that her point had landed with devastating force. And how would the court, he began, the words coming out slowly, carefully, delineate the scope of such a duty? In practice, the entire courtroom exhaled. He hadn't refuted her. He hadn't challenged her premise. He had moved on. He had implicitly accepted the existence of the duty and was now asking about its application. It was a monumental shift. Pam Bondi had not just won a point. She had reframed the entire constitutional question. The rest of her allotted time was a blur of technical follow-ups from the other justices, but the decisive blow had been struck. When she finally concluded and returned to her seat, her young associate Marcus Thorne looked at her with an expression of pure awe. He had been in the room when she planned it, but seeing it executed, seeing its effect on the Chief Justice himself, was something else entirely. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, her own composure absolute. When Julian Hayes rose for his rebuttal, the atmosphere had completely changed. He was a skilled advocate, and he did his best to rally, to pull the conversation back to the rights of the individual. But it felt like he was shouting against the wind. The court's intellectual center of gravity had shifted. His arguments, so powerful an hour before, now seemed to be missing the point. He was talking about the islands, while the court was now contemplating the nature of the continent. As the final rap of the gavel signaled the end of the session, the chamber erupted in a flurry of movement. As Bondi and her team gathered their papers, a court clerk, a man who had worked there for 30 years and had seen hundreds of arguments, caught her eye and gave a slow, respectful nod. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The scene outside the courthouse was a media frenzy. The reporters who had been inside were already on their phones, dictating the story to their newsrooms. The key phrase was on everyone's lips, the pause. On the live broadcast, Evelyn Reed's voice was filled with a rare excitement. "I have been covering this court for 25 years," she told the anchor, "and I have never seen a moment quite like that. What we witnessed was not just a clever legal tactic. It was a piece of pure legal artistry." Pam Bondi did not try to defeat the Chief Justice's argument. She assimilated it. She turned his own jurisprudence into the most powerful weapon in her arsenal. The Chief Justice's pause, that hesitation, that was the sound of a paradigm shifting in real time. He wasn't just momentarily stumped. He was confronted with the inescapable coherence of his own legal philosophy being applied in a way he had never conceived. It was, without a doubt, a masterstroke. In the hours that followed, the moment went viral. The court sketch of Roberts, frozen, and Bondi, focused, became an iconic image. News networks played the audio of the exchange over and over, followed by expert analysis. The phrase "the Roberts pause" became a trending topic on social media. Memes were created, some humorous, some serious, but all centered on that singular, silent moment of intellectual capture. Law professors wrote instant blog posts, dissecting the brilliance of the strategy. It was hailed for its precision, its audacity, and its deep respect for the court's own history. Bondi hadn't come in with insults or political attacks. She had come in with a better, more profound legal argument that was built on the court's own foundation. In their respective debriefing sessions, the contrast was stark. Julian Hayes's team was somber. "I never saw it coming," Hayes admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I prepared for every precedent, every historical argument. I never imagined she would build her entire case on Sebelius. It was brilliant. I have to respect the move. But I am deeply concerned about what it means for civil liberties if they accept that logic." Meanwhile, Bondi's office was buzzing with a quiet, controlled elation. Marcus Thorne was practically vibrating with energy. "They have to vote with us now," he said. "How can the Chief Justice rule against his own reasoning?" Pam Bondi, however, remained the calm center of the storm. "One moment does not win a case," she cautioned, though a hint of satisfaction warmed her voice. "It's a long path from oral argument to a final opinion. The justices will debate this fiercely among themselves." But she allowed, a small smile finally gracing her lips. "We gave them the best possible path to follow. We gave the Chief Justice a way to rule for us that is consistent with his own core judicial principles. Today, we did our job." The weeks that followed were a period of intense national waiting. The DSDPA case dominated the legal and political news cycle. Pundits debated the potential outcomes. Would the Chief Justice side with the liberal wing and his own Sebelius logic, or would he side with the conservatives, finding a way to distinguish this case and limit his previous ruling? The court's silence was absolute, adding to the suspense. Inside the Marble Palace, the justices were circulating draft opinions, debating, persuading, and compromising. Chief Justice Roberts, in the privacy of his chambers, reportedly spent weeks wrestling with the opinion, knowing that his legacy would be deeply intertwined with its reasoning. He reread his own words in Sebelius, and he reread the transcript of Bondi's argument, recognizing the elegant, inescapable trap she had laid. She hadn't forced him into a corner. She had illuminated a path he had already paved, a path he now had to decide whether to walk down. Then, on a crisp morning in late June, the wait was over. The day of the final rulings of the term had arrived. The courtroom was packed, the sense of anticipation even greater than it had been for the oral arguments. The clerks began distributing the bound volumes of the day's opinions. Reporters frantically flipped through the pages of the DSDPA case, their eyes scanning for the conclusion. On television, Evelyn Reed had a copy rushed to her on set. She put on her reading glasses, her face a mask of concentration as she read the opening lines of the syllabus. The camera held on her face. A moment passed. She looked up, directly into the lens. "The Supreme Court," she announced, her voice steady and clear, "has just released its opinion in Federal Government versus the Alliance for Digital Freedom. The court has voted to uphold the Digital Sovereignty and Data Privacy Act. The vote is 5-4. A gasp went through the studio. "The majority opinion," she continued, her eyes finding the key detail, "is written by Chief Justice John Roberts." She began to read excerpts from the opinion, and the brilliance of Bondi's strategy became finally apparent. The Chief Justice's opinion was a masterwork of careful, narrow, and yet decisive reasoning. He did not grant the government a sweeping, unlimited power. Instead, he carefully adopted the framework Bondi had offered. He wrote of the unique nature of the digital domain, acknowledging it as a foundational aspect of modern national life. And then, Citing his own reasoning in Sibelius, he affirmed that while the government's powers are not unlimited, the state's very sovereignty carries with it an inherent duty to protect the integrity of the nation's most critical infrastructure from existential threats. The DSDPA, he concluded, was a constitutional regulation of this inherent sovereign duty, with sufficient checks and balances to pass muster. He had accepted her premise. He had walked down the path she had illuminated for him. In her office, Pam Bondi watched the broadcast alone. She listened to Evelyn Reed praise the subtlety and intellectual consistency of the Chief Justice's opinion. She saw the graphic on the screen showing the court sketch from that day in April, the image of her, calm and focused, and the Chief Justice, frozen in a moment of profound reconsideration. Her face remained composed, but a deep, quiet sense of satisfaction settled over her. It wasn't the thrill of victory or the roar of the crowd. It was the quiet, profound fulfillment of a strategist who had seen the entire board, anticipated every move, and laid a single, perfect, undeniable piece of logic in the precise center, knowing it would change the outcome of the entire game. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. The masterstroke had not just been a moment of high drama in a courtroom. It had become the very foundation of the law of the land. The pause, now an iconic media clip, had been the silent, pivotal moment where the future of digital governance in the nation had been decided. The work was done.